Tom had lived a very good life and was a good husband and father for many, many years. He had managed to live normally for a long time.
My father is alive, but he is no longer my father. Just a ghost trapped inside a living body, wandering around the hospital ward, locked inside to keep him from walking to the next bar. His body on autopilot, his brain destroyed, no longer able to talk or laugh. I wonder if there are any thoughts inside his mind. My eyes meet his to reveal a sense of vague confusion, not seeming to recognize me nor himself. It is only a facade, soon followed by a vacant glance, the result of self-inflicted suicide, an illness called alcoholism.
Tom was born in New York City. He and his parents and his younger sister moved to Ridgewood, New Jersey, when he was about 5, 6 years old, and he lived there all through school and as an adult until after we were married. And he always had an exuberant interest in trains. Had a train built in his mother's basement, and trains that ran all over bridges and tunnels, and was quite complex. And Tom and I met on a blind date. His best friend Bill was dating one of my roommates. We were living in New York City. I graduated from nursing school the year before, and about 1956, 55. That's 55. When we got engaged, I felt I had to tell Tom something that I considered a terrible secret, that my mother was an alcoholic, and I was convinced that no one would want to marry me because I had a mother who was an alcoholic. And he listened and he accepted it. And I also remember telling him that he must never, ever let me see him drunk, because nothing would kill my love for him faster than if I saw him drunk. In my mind, there was a terrible social stigma of alcoholism because my mother was an alcoholic. And I personally didn't really deal with it. I sort of put 3,000 miles between myself and my mother and continued my education, but I didn't really deal with the disease of alcoholism. Tom was at Boy Scout camp when they came and got him to bring him home after his father committed suicide. He was told several times over the years that, he now had to be the man of the family, which is a pretty strong burden to dump on the shoulders of an 11-year-old. After Tom's father died, apparently he became someone that nobody discussed, as though he had never existed, which was rather sort of an uncomfortable situation. He was very close to a minister in town, Mr. Miller, and I had learned from Mr. Miller just before we were married, that he had died from committing suicide. And the first year we were married, Tom left some insurance papers out with, really, I think, with the intention of my seeing it. And on it, there was the question how his father died, and it said suicide. And that was the one and only time that it was ever written on any papers that that's how his father died. It was always he had a heart attack in the future. And Tom never discussed his father committing suicide.
Underneath all of his successes, my father was struggling to conceal 35 years of denial of the suicide of his father. If his father only knew that his last thoughts in his suicide note would not be true, Tom would not be okay.
The loss of Dad's father in his life had significant effects on his whole family, on him, that I think he picked up, and I think he learned to numb out his own feelings, and I think he learned to push everything, submerge everything, and I think drinking was one way of changing the way he felt, because he wasn't happy with how he felt.
There were no photographs or memories of my grandfather. He was effectively erased from my father's life, from everyone's life. It was one of those dark family secrets that was kept hidden. The truth behind the secret was not revealed to me until I was an adult. It was not until I made this movie that I discovered pictures of my grandfather and got a glimpse of what he looked like.
And I had a father who was a suicide survivor, who wasn't healthy, who carried with him anger and shame surrounding it, and who by example taught me how not to deal with things, and how not to feel, and how not to communicate, and how to let it really be self-destructive.
Tom started drinking when he was 16, and he continued drinking from then on. In his first rehab that he was in, they asked him to write a history, and they also asked him when he realized that his drinking was out of control, and that was actually 2 years after we were married, which was 1950, would have been 1959 at the time. And I know when I realized that, I was so hurt. I said, well, why didn't you go for help? And his statement was he didn't know where to go. But in the counselor in Al-Anon, they said, he really wasn't ready for help at that point. But it was a lot of years that he had a drinking problem.
My father's involvement in the volunteer fire department was part of his life that was important to him. As a child, I was proud of my father and was always thrilled to have the opportunity to go to the firehouse and see the trucks and equipment firsthand. Now that I look back at his involvement in the firehouse, I can see it as another life that he led that was separate from his family life at home, a place for him to escape, to hang out with the guys, to drink.
Well, we met shortly after he joined the fire department, and he came in 1959, and I was chief at that time, and he had a great intelligence as far as mathematics go. He went to many schools and never fluffed off on any of them. He felt that he had to do this because of the upcoming advances of modern fire practices. But he was, to my mind, it was one of the better firemen we had years ago, an excellent chief. He did his job right to the T. He had very good rapport with the fire council and mayor also at that time when he was in, which makes a big difference in your term in firematics. I said he had a lot of friends. People who liked him and looked up to him with a lot of respect, including myself.
Tom was in the fire department for over 25 years. He's now considered an honorary lifelong member. His name still resides on the board in the fire department. And he had a lot of pleasure in it. A lot of male companionship, which was important. And as years went by, more and more time was spent at the fire department and less time at home, and which I resented. But it's very difficult to resent a fire department when they're doing things that save lives and people's property and things like that. And I realize now, looking back, the alcoholism was the true factor that was devouring his life and his time. And I think the first time I was aware that he was drunk was our 15th wedding anniversary. And we went out to dinner, and I guess he probably had some to drink beforehand and some to drink during the dinner, and I was embarrassed and angry. I guess things sort of settled down, and he pretty much controlled his drinking for a while certainly around the house. But I also didn't know that how much was too much in drinking, that it wasn't, consuming a six-pack of beer was abnormal. I didn't realize that. Because the longer you drink, the higher your tolerance goes, and you apparently are still functioning, but you're literally and legally drunk. You don't see what you don't want to see. And eventually it affected his work. And I got married. Tom was working in Patterson, was in the printing business. But eventually, after 25 years working for this company, he was going to get away and went to a different company and was there 3 or 4 years, 3 years or 4 years, and then left that company and went to another one. And eventually this pattern of changing jobs deteriorated into him living in a make-believe world that he was had a job, but you didn't see paychecks, and pretended he was job hunting.
Well, I went to college at home, and I think I left home when I was 21. And so I was living in Manhattan at the time that basically everything hit the fan with Dad. And I remember getting a phone call from Mom saying, I called him at work and he doesn't work there anymore. And I remember her feeling pretty upset and also freaked out, and you know, it was shocking, because she thought he was working and he had hidden the fact that he had lost his job to her. For me to describe Dad, I see him in kind of 3 stages, where when I was young, like grade school, he was healthier, and a little more present and involved with us, with me. And then as I got older, teenager, he became less present, you know, definitely was not available and was not a presence. I remember him waking up at whatever, leaving the house at 8 o'clock in the morning and coming home at 11 o'clock at night and going to bed and doing the same thing, you know, and then being gone on the weekends. And then, you know, as an adult, his health really started to deteriorate, and he went into that stage of going in and out of detox and rehab, and basically his life just was a disaster, like a roller coaster downward.
My sisters and I had many fun times with my father. Because my father was functioning at an apparently normal level, my family life seemed completely normal. We used to love to mess up his hair, have tickle fights, or toss a baseball in the backyard with him. When we were young, our father included us in his work around the house in a fun way. My father smoked a pipe, and we used to plead with him to blow smoke rings for us. I thought that was great. Later, when I was around 9 and I learned how bad smoking was, we asked my father to quit. We hid all his pipes, which made him angry, and only made him hide his smoking habits from us. Nicotine addiction often goes hand in hand with alcohol addiction.
Now, one of his great portraits that we always admired at him, there was another fella too that was in the fire with his pipe. He was always here with his pipe smoking on that thing like you would, like an old steam engine at times. That was one of his portraits. He always had that pipe going.
Tom was not a violent drunk, not an obnoxious drunk. He would just fall asleep. And you couldn't wake him up. And for years I just figured that he worked so hard that he was just so tired that you couldn't wake him up. It never occurred to me that it was alcohol. That he was literally unconscious. What happened in the house was to get things done around the yard, or the things that had to be done around the house. It was turning me into more of a nag, to get after him, to get something done that he promised to do. More responsibility was, and household responsibilities were going on me, and as his ability to function was decreasing.
My father drank wine occasionally, but mostly beer. He always stocked at least one case of Miller beer in the old refrigerator in the basement. I never thought anything unusual about his drinking, just that he did it regularly and seemed to enjoy a drink with some cheese and crackers after a long day at work. Although I did feel his absence at times and wished he would have been there, I always bought into the family line that Dad had to work late. My mother was always in attendance at school events, despite my father's absence. She was able to fill the role of parental involvement enough to satisfy my own need to show my talents and accomplishments and receive her accolades and praise.
But he gave the message that your life's not worthy of being involved with. So there was a loss of being able to relate, a loss of warmth, because I remember as a little kid really wanting to be there with him and to hold his hand when we went into New York or whatever. There was that loss of connection and a physical loss of his presence, as well as being mentally not there and emotionally unavailable.
I always liked to help out my father with projects around the house, such as when we built a recreation room in the basement. I would offer to help, and we would work for a while, and then the excuse would arrive. He would have to go out to the hardware store to buy something for the project. Then half an hour to an hour later he would phone, saying he had been to 3 stores unable to find the item in need. Eventually he would return, but usually his project was done for the day. I was always disappointed we didn't get more work done, but I didn't really have a clue what was going on with him, that he needed to escape and get a drink. My disappointment regarding his absence was the beginning of the loss of my father, although it was not nearly as devastating as his final stage where I truly lost my father.
Well, I think the later years with him when I was a young adult there wasn't too meaningful of a connection, and I had a real awareness that he wasn't that interested in what I was doing with my life. Like, my music didn't really interest him, to where he wanted to, he had a real desire to come hear me perform or understand the music, and I think it was very kind of superficial interaction.
My father would hide his pain and alcoholism for 40 years. Then slowly the numbing alcohol would show its effects. In his later stage, when I was in my 20s, he was unable to function normally. Slowly the lies and deceits surfaced. He pretended he was job hunting, but I knew nobody would hire him when I saw the jumbled, disjunct-looking resume.
Went with him to his doctor and expressing my concern about his drinking. But nobody was truly confirming what my worries were. I was like, I had the feeling that I was looked at as though I was overreacting or things like that. A lot of people are uncomfortable dealing with alcoholism, including doctors. And we went into marital counseling in an attempt to improve things. And I was talking to the doctor who was doing the counseling one day. I said, something's very wrong. So he said he wanted him to have a neurological workup. So he called the medical doctor and said he wanted him to have the whole neurological workup. And I took Tom to the neurologist, and the neurologist interviewed him, did some basic tests in the office, and wrote a report that he didn't think there was anything wrong with Tom, but that the wife was overreacting, and she was the one that thought there was a problem. And then we went for an MRI, and this neurologist, I didn't know this at the time, what his reaction was. After the MRI proved that there was decided brain damage, the neurologist had to write a subsequent letter to the psychiatrist who had been doing the counseling and admit that there was brain damage here. My background as a nurse probably made me more aware of the very serious negative effects of alcoholism, because when I first realized that he had brain damage, I really knew what was ahead. I was terrified that I knew what was ahead. And yet my true knowledge of alcoholism was minimal. I knew what the very negative side effects of alcoholism could be, but I didn't truly understand until I'd gone to the different groups and educational groups and codependency and Al-Anon and things like that. I learned a great deal more from there, which I think as a result made me a better nurse, particularly with those patients that were alcoholics.
The last stage of his life began with his conscious efforts at detoxification and rehabilitation from his disease, and ended when his life went out of control and he fell between the cracks and dropped out of the mainstream. I have mixed feelings about the loss of my father. Part of me resents my father for not being able to get in touch with his feelings, for not being able to control his alcoholism, and for wasting his life. Another part of me is able to accept that he was genetically predisposed to the disease which he could not control. I can trace the disease in my family for 4 generations. Alcohol is a physically addictive substance. My mother learned many of the tricks of the trade, how alcoholics survive. We all stopped enabling him. Another side of my father was surfacing. The person I used to know as Dad was changing. It was like he had this underground life which involved drinking, and who knows what else, and had become very cunning in finding ways to support this other lifestyle that was taking over.
I think the last part of our lives together with him was horrible. And after he lost his job, at that, not that there was only one job he lost, but the last job that he really held, after he lost that, then it was one disaster after another. It was just one tragedy after another. I mean, if it was Mom being afraid he was going to burn down the house because he was so irresponsible with the appliances or whatever, and also him incidences like him totaling his car, him falling off a fire truck and being dragged and being really hurt by that, him falling down the stairs, him like crashing on his bicycle, him getting his bicycle stolen. I mean, it went downhill from there to him. That was during a time when he was in and out of the rehabs, failing out of the rehabs, and in total denial and unable to get a grip and help himself. And his life was spiraling downward out of control. And it was one disaster after another. It just got worse and worse and worse. And I remember us all being worried that he was going to kill someone, because we couldn't keep him from driving. And
Now, when he was attending the alcohol rehab programs and the AA, he had total lack of ability to have insight into his problem. He lived in a world that I think he made up in his head. He was going to AA every night and all this, and so that was good. He was doing good. And it was like lip service, but his ability to stop drinking was not there. I think because he was taught to stuff it for so many years, he lacked the ability to feel things as deeply or have insight into his feelings. Well, Tom went through the one rehab and verbalized all the positive things that we wanted to hear. But he did go back to drinking. And eventually he was admitted into a detoxification unit again in hospital, and in that time they had an option of a rehab unit that was supposedly for 3 months. That was supposed to be a very special unit and facility, and I had great hopes for there, because if anybody could help them, he could get helped in this place. He did go into this rehab facility, and at the same time, the family were going through different programs as codependent, as a wife, and adult children of alcoholics programs for my daughters, and going to Al-Anon, which was very helpful, and programs that were also conducted for the families at the rehab facilities. And it was very much of a learning process for me. This alcoholism is definitely a family disease. It just does not affect only the person who's drinking, but it affects all the family members.
So he was really in a good place to get help. And Mom was really putting out a lot of money to have him there. And it was the type of thing, I remember her saying she would throw him in a snake pit if she thought that's what would help him. She was willing to do anything to help him. And the people there were great, and they told us that they tried everything with him, that he had just drank too much for too long, and he was gone, and you better protect yourself. And the woman told Mom, you work too hard for your money, and I can't take your money anymore, to try and rehabilitate him. And he was there for 3 months, which was the minimum stay, and then they wished him farewell, which I think he saw as a good thing, but we all saw as a negative thing, because basically he had failed out of the best rehabilitation program in the state. Mom knew she was 100% right on the money when she said, you better protect yourself. And I remember Mom saying to me, what do I do now? And I remember saying, you divorce him. Gotta divorce him, there's no other choice. Because, you know, he had been running up credit card bills, he had been borrowing against some homeowner's loan or something like that. He had been just going through money, and of course she was the only one who was working at that time, and he was a real problem financially, a real liability.
One day I got this call from the head of the rehab facility saying that I should come and pick Tom up, that they could not help him anymore. And I had a meeting with her, and she literally told me he'd been drinking for too many years, and they couldn't reach him. And she said all the different things that they had tried with him, including making him angry, but she couldn't even make him angry. He didn't have the ability to even have that emotion anymore. So, family and daughters and I were very devastated. And the day that we brought him home in the car, he just couldn't wait to get out and get drinking. After he got out of the last rehab, he went downhill very rapidly.
I had seen a clearer side of my father while he was alcohol-free for 3 months. I noticed that his eyes were wide open. I always thought that was just the way his eyes were, that his eyes were always half closed. It was then that I realized that the drinking made his eyes that way. I will never forget that instance of truly realizing that this is what my father is like when he is not drinking. He looked different. And also the disappointment that went along with it, that he was in a fog for most of my life.
Yeah, the process of losing Tom went on over a lot of years. As the disease of alcoholism progressed, and I finally moved him into another bedroom. And then would come home at hours and either end up in the bedroom and I'd have to kick him out, or stand over my bed and demand money. And it was a little scary, and I used to have to sleep with my pocketbook under my pillow. Because you have had to learn that you can no longer trust this person. So you've lost trust, you've lost love, you've lost trust. You've lost security because they no longer have a job. But you also realize that you're a lot stronger than you thought you were. And that you can support yourself in the house. And eventually the psychologist suggested that I put a bolt on my door, padlock, because I really couldn't relax and go to sleep. He was getting to the point where he was scary. The unpredictability. And eventually, I was going to say it was the final loss when, after we were divorced, and he finally found a place to stay, where I asked him to leave the house, period. It's not the final loss, because the final loss hasn't even happened now. I guess the final loss won't occur until he's literally physically dead, as well as emotionally dead.
I wanted him to get his act together, even though I knew he was considered hopeless, and the chances were very slim that he would be able to recover. One time I gave him a ride to the train station, but I had to stop even that after an incident where his desperation really scared me. I knew he could no longer be trusted and was desperate for money to pursue his addiction. So I put my wallet on the floor to my left while driving in the car with him, so it was out of his sight and reach. I had a change tray in my car, which probably contained a few dollars. Upon arriving at the train station, he tried to grab my change. I quickly covered the change tray with my hand, denying him even 1 penny. My hand blocked his hand as he tried frantically to get some change. My adrenaline was pumping. This was a very tense moment and a very tense 10-minute drive. This incident is also the closest I came to a physical fight with my father. His personality was changing, and you weren't sure what he would do next. Although he claimed he needed train fare, I knew he would use it to drink. To deny my father even 1 penny was difficult, but if I enabled him to have 1 more drink, it would have been wrong. You have to be strong to stick to your convictions about what is right, and be willing to suffer with your heart as you watch someone you love go downhill. This is what Al-Anon calls tough love.
The aspect of really facing the facts was very, very depressing. Very depressing. And I was glad I could have some friends to talk to, and I was glad I was active in Al-Anon and going for therapy. All things are needed. I just couldn't get enough education or help. It was just like I had to reach out in all different directions. And I was finally realizing that that I couldn't live like this any longer. It was scary to have him in the house because I was afraid he was going to set the house on fire. And he was a constant smoker, even though he'd claimed for years that he had stopped smoking, but he would smoke out of my sight, like the drinking. Because I had a family where there was a lot of divorce, and in the family I was determined when I got married that I would never get divorced. And which is probably one reason I fought divorce for as many years as I did. And because I considered it a failure. And I had been very busy covering up problems in my married life, between my family and my work, and but as his disease progressed, I had to talk to my staff at the hospital that my husband, that I was divorcing him, and that he was a very bad alcoholic, and that he very well may end up as a patient on the floor. And then one time we were in the middle of morning report, and he came up on the floor, and I was in a room off the hallway, and I heard his voice, and it was like, oh my God, that's my husband. And my staff just, well, they quickly closed the door, circled around me, changed me so that I couldn't be seen, and told me that he's your ex-husband. And it was very supportive and nurturing on their part. And the same when he would come into the emergency room, the nurses would take care of him and feed him and whatever, but they tried to protect me by not letting me know that he'd been in. And they were very supportive at a very painful time in my life. We got divorced. I got divorced, and he actually stayed and lived at the house for a while, giving him time to find some place to reside, which he did. He found a room, and at that point I requested that he leave. After we were divorced, and I had also had a restraining order filed against him after he broke into the house 2-3 times. He'd been protected in town as well by the police and the firemen, because he had been so active in the town, and so when he totaled a car, they just brought him home. He was never arrested at that point for being drunk or anything. And they actually tried to talk me out of filing the restraining orders. They wanted me to drop charges. And fortunately, I was aware enough that I said, well, is there going to be any record that he's broken into the house 3 times?
Of course, the police did him no favors by letting him off the hook. My mother and I were also able to look back at his history of car accidents, like the time he said he was run off the road by another car, and other more minor accidents, and see that he had made excuses to cover up his accidents. The truth is, he totaled 3 cars in 15 years, and he probably ran himself off the road. Slowly, as we looked back and analyzed his life, it was like putting pieces of a puzzle together that made sense now, but we didn't know were missing before. But not having a car did not stop him from continuing his daily excursions to bars, of course always under another guise. He rode an old bicycle until that was lost or gone, at which point he just switched to getting rides here and there and walking everywhere. Because I lived close by, I would often pass him walking on the streets while I was driving. This was my last connection with my father, which I held on to in a certain way. I would always beep the horn, and he would nod or wave. We were living in 2 completely separate worlds, but we could still connect on this one level. One of the most poignant, distressing situations for me was passing my father one morning on my way to work, not far from his home. I passed him and beeped the horn. Only this time he did not acknowledge my reply. He raised his head, saw me, and just looked down and kept walking. This was a critical turning point for me, that my own father would not even acknowledge or communicate with me. He was out of my life now. I cried.
The majority of the people that we went out with socially were no longer there for me. And also realized that I had to make more of an effort to reach out to other people, that I had been very busy keeping myself protected emotionally. And but I think one of the biggest things that I learned to do was to open up and let people in, past my defense system, and be honest what was going on. That was very hard because I was very busy putting up a front for many years.
I know, because we tried to help him out several times. This was after the fact. Myself and one of the other firemen, we had to go to Suffering to bail him out of the police station. And we took him back, took him down to in Hawthorne where he was residing at that time, and then we also paid some of his rent for staying there. We took care of that before. That's how much we thought of him. Well, we've talked to him, yeah, we did. Like I say, we took him home a couple times, fireman, myself, and we've talked to him several times. In fact, I had him here one night, fed him supper in the firehouse, went home and got a meal for him. In fact, he stayed here a couple times in the firehouse overnight. We let him stay here because he had no place to go, and we just couldn't see shutting him out. For not the service that he gave to us. No way. We would never turn anybody away.
Well, when Dad started to deteriorate, it was a difficult time, and it was frustrating because we tried to help him to help himself. We weren't successful, and it was a challenge to behave in a healthy way, to maintain my own life and not let it overwhelm me to where I became dysfunctional. Like, I remember having to perform on television, and a lot of stuff was going down with him, and it was pretty draining. And I remember just the challenge of really just the challenge of being able to perform and be at my best during his time of tragedy was a challenge.
Eventually, he had this sort of wanderlust, and I don't know whether he walked out of the room where he was residing or what, and he was just he actually became a street person, living on the streets.
He covered territory from Bergen and Passaic counties in New Jersey to Rockland and Westchester counties in New York. Walking did not stop him from getting around or stop him from drinking. When he wanted a meal or some attention or a warm place, he had a routine in which he would show up at the emergency room of a hospital claiming he had chest pains. Several times when he was homeless, I received calls from social workers at hospitals. I would listen to their update about his heart pains, and then I would inform them of his real problem. One time the police called me to come and pick him up. I refused, telling them that I was not about to save my father from every situation he got into. The professional advice was to let him deal with the consequences of his own actions, and hope that when he hit bottom he might realize he has a problem and seek professional help. The police told me that we can't just let him out on the streets. I had to tell them that was their problem to deal with. I think my response was shocking to the police and others as well. It was not an easy thing to do, but once I was determined not to enable him, it kind of became a routine response. Most people do not understand the disease of alcoholism and how to deal with it.
And I remember many times during his alcoholic problems, and advanced alcoholic problems, I should say, he came to our door at night for a ride up to his AA meetings. And several times Rudy took him up to, I guess it was Oakland at the time. And many times we saw him walking around the streets in his advanced alcoholic problems, walking around the streets in a woman's fur coat, and bitter cold weather, and he had no place to go. But at that point, he didn't bother anybody. He didn't even come to our house at that point. I don't know whether it was through embarrassment or whether he just had been just so far gone that he didn't remember anymore. It was sometimes very obvious that he was under the influence, and other times he could handle it very well, and you'd think he was cold sober, but he wasn't. And he was not only fooling other people, but he was fooling himself at that point.
Eventually, my father ended up in the county jail for criminal acts unnatural to his old self. Boy, is that shocking, to see your father dressed in the orange jumpsuit, the uniform of the jail inmate, locked in a building surrounded by barbed wire. I still loved him, even though he was in jail. He stole a pickup truck that someone had parked and left running at a gas station. He was also eventually caught for pulling a series of fire alarm boxes in Ridgewood, the town where he grew up. I see this as his desperate, silent plea for help. He was also sleeping in an historic grist mill that was being relocated to a new lot and was temporarily put in a local park. He fell asleep while smoking his pipe and lit the structure on fire. He awoke in time to escape, walked to a gas station across the street, and watched the firemen put out the blaze. The structure was ruined. I don't know if it was an accidental fire or not.
There's a man that had no control over himself. I think he probably felt he needed help. That's why he did what he did. Not that he wanted to be recognized, he was lonely. I think the other thing involved in Ridgewood there, that fire, was an accident, strictly an accident, I think.
To elaborate, I think it was part of the disease of alcoholism. As Rudy said, looking for help, not knowing where to look, but looking for help, shouting to somebody to help him, and nobody hearing that shout for help.
One of the firemen who was a good friend actually took Tom in to stay with him overnight or a couple of nights, and he realized at that point that he couldn't have Tom in the house anymore, and I think he also realized a little bit more what I had been going through. I'd hear from different neighbors where he'd come and he wanted money, and which was embarrassing. Yes, there is a social stigma with alcoholism. As somebody is falling apart, they're not functioning out in the world in an acceptable manner. And as a codependent or a wife, I was very busy trying to make things right and cover things up and not let anybody see this, and because it was embarrassing. And you get very busy trying to pretend everything is perfect, or okay anyway. It was a hard thing to learn in Al-Anon that sometimes the alcoholic really had to hit bottom before they could start coming up, or before they could realize that they really had a problem. Unfortunately, that's a very difficult thing to watch or to judge, and the fact that you have to learn to say no, very difficult thing to learn. That you aren't doing the alcoholic a favor by making things easy for him, or doing his job, or cleaning up after him, or whatever.
He eventually was released from jail, having served his time, and continued to wander the streets. The weather was getting cold, and eventually he was picked up by the police because he was wandering the streets dressed inappropriately for the season. He was sent to the hospital for analysis of his condition, where he ended up on the psychiatric ward. I went to visit him there, and I remember walking down the corridor of about 12 rooms, where each room had outside it a sign saying, "Not Tom's room," until eventually we passed one room where the sign said, "Tom's room." He was so confused that he was always mistakenly going into other patients' rooms thinking it was his own. The social worker looked hard to eventually find a place that would accept him, not an easy task. Many places refused to take him because of his condition. He didn't really fit into the psychiatric ward, and he didn't quite fit into the nursing home category because of whatever excuse they could conveniently find. Eventually, he was accepted by a veterans hospital onto a long-term care floor, a locked ward. It gave him a decent place to stay, food to eat, and kept him out of trouble.
One thing that made him more horrible at that time was that Murph was dying of cancer. Murph was our close family friend, who was probably a little older than Dad, so same generation. So here was someone, Dad was someone who was unable to help himself to become healthy, and always had been, to the point where he self-destructed. And then Murph was stricken with cancer and had no options and was slowly dying, and it made made both demises more tragic, because I remember feeling like Dad should have died and Murph should have lived.
Unable to handle his own affairs after his downward spiral, my father fell into the hands of social workers. In an attempt to deal with his situation, I had taken on financial control of his Social Security income after the social worker had already set up the process of having a representative handle his affairs. I am told that the best thing to do is to take his money and put it into a tax-free trust account immediately to pay for his future funeral expenses. The thought was bizarre to me. The man was not yet dead. I looked into the funeral trust program and contemplated how to best approach the issue. While my father was still in a state of partial cognizance, my sister accompanied me to ask him if he had thought about plans for his death. Much to my surprise, he told me he wanted an open casket at a specific funeral home and cemetery in the town where he grew up. I met with the funeral director and proceeded with the plans. I chose the casket and the number of hours for the wake. I was blown away by the details I had to consider, since these personal thoughts on death were never discussed in my family. Next, I proceeded to the cemetery, where I bought and chose the location of his plot. The cemetery superintendent brought me to the family gravesite. This was the closest I had come to any tangible acquaintance with my grandfather. No space was available there, so I chose a site not too distant, for I felt in the deepest sense there was a close connection between the lives and fates of my father and my grandfather. When I inquired about the tombstone and questioned them as to how to handle prepayment of the tombstone, I was told they can install it with his name engraved and add the death date later. No, this was too surreal to imagine. A grave ready and waiting as time ticked along. Well, my father has hit bottom. For some alcoholics, this means getting divorced, going to jail, or losing a job or a place to live. For my father, it meant hitting the point of no return. The problem was that he never felt so desperate as to feel forced into getting himself help. He just accepted his downhill progression a step at a time and kept on going until he fell headfirst into the gutter. It is as though my father is dead, even though physically he is still alive. My father's personality, the things unique to him that made him an individual human being, do not exist anymore. He is incapable of having any relationship with me in any way. His role as a father is non-existent. He is unable to recognize who I am. I can talk to him, but I get no response. His body still functions on some levels. He can still walk and eat, although his diet consists of strained foods to prevent choking. The only step further down from where he is now is physiological death. I do not think he benefits from my visits, and it is more difficult to return every time. Yet I feel guilty if I do not see him once a year. But every time I return, his decay worsens, and with it my depression and the time between my next return. It is sad to think he will never know his grandchildren or anything of his family's future, but my son will know of his grandfather's life and death.
Oh, sure, he's still in our mind. You don't forget people like that very easily.
It's sad. You can't really have a relationship with someone who can't respond to you. So it's sort of brings up memories of love and also feelings of sadness at the same time. And I guess one of the sad things is he has two grandsons that are in love with trains, and how much he would have enjoyed being able to share that enthusiasm with them. But he's probably not even really aware that he has those grandsons.
It is difficult to have much social support outside of my immediate family while my father was going through the final stage of a socially stigmatized disease. My father was an alcoholic, a criminal, and a homeless person, all at various times, characteristics which are all socially devalued in our society. Along with this was also the fact that his demise was not openly recognized by society as a death, although his status within society has changed drastically and can be viewed as a social death. One of the difficult things about my father's death is that there are no public rituals in which to cope with this kind of loss. I suffered a lot of grief privately.
The only meaning I could see to any kind of tragedy is understanding it and breaking the cycle of dysfunction. The good that's come out of his loss is he's set a real example of what not to do. So if you're open to looking at it, there's something to be learned. And it's a chance for us all to do better, to understand how he became the way he did and the mistakes that he made, and how to not make those mistakes yourself.
After you go through these different losses, then I finally learned to make peace with things and take pleasure in remembering all the good times. And eventually the bad times fade away, even though today I've had to dredge up a lot of them. It doesn't hurt like it used to. And you go through a phase where at one time you think everything was bad. And then as you develop, you realize that it wasn't all bad. A lot of it was very good and very positive. Through the losses, I discovered I had a lot more strength than I thought I did. And I discovered I could be very happy. So along with losses, you also have growth.
I have searched for some kind of meaning that I might have gained through his tragedy and suffering. I have found that this experience has strengthened my relationship with my mother and deepened my respect for her. It is difficult to find anything positive in regards to my situation and relation with my father. The only conclusion I have come to is that experiencing his disease has forced me to become an expert on the disease of alcoholism. Due to my knowledge and experience, I am aware of my own possible genetic predisposition to addiction and consequently my son's. This knowledge has made me aware of the dysfunctional family characteristics that accompany addiction and enabled me to hopefully break the cycle that I can now trace through the generations on both sides of my family. I don't know whether I would be prone to following in my father's footsteps, but I don't have to wait and see. I can cut off that possibility before it occurs. Also, through my in-depth examination of my father's life and the exposing of issues surrounding alcoholism, suicide, hidden family secrets, and social death, I hope to break the unhealthy family patterns of not coping with loss and suppression of feelings.
I think as a person, I probably became a better person as a result of going through these losses, and a more human person.
And I also think that Mom became a lot healthier after he left, and that was a great thing. And she became easier to talk to and to deal with because she wasn't in denial herself. The fact that she became healthier helped me because she was able to point out things about my life that were pretty sick. What I gained from the loss of one parent, I think, was a healthier relationship with the other parent and a healthier self.
Yeah, I went through different stages of grieving, and I got probably the most extreme was wondering if I was really ever in love when I got married, and was anything that we had real. But that was probably more the anger phase and such. But yeah, you do go through the different phases, and for a while you can just remember the hurts and the pain, and then you suddenly realize that with the aid with a lot of work and a lot of therapy and such, being able to realize that it didn't hurt anymore. And I can remember what that wonderful feeling of being at peace and not hurting. And it was a great feeling to achieve that, to not be angry at him and or not being in pain, but remembering the good. And that's a very peaceful way, and I like being there.
I understand what transpired in his life to make him the way he was. And, you know, that I loved him regardless. And also that, you know, I hate him and I resent him for what he did to me, because I deserved more.
Sometimes I wish my father would physically die so that I can experience closure, finish the formal death rituals, and close the door on his tragic state of affairs. I could then get on with the final grieving process that I know I will have to go through when he does physically die. This is a selfish desire. I would no longer have to deal with him in his current debilitated state, and I feel a measure of guilt at times knowing that I will feel liberated on some level when he dies. I feel like I want to put him behind me, but I can't.
He's just living from day to day, not knowing or caring at this point about anyone.
He's still part of our fire department as far as we're concerned. Even though where he is, but he's still part of us. Oh, after all these years.
There's no relationship with Dad now. So there's no relationship with him. There's no recognition of him when you walk in the room. You don't know if he knows who you are now. If we were to walk in the room, there's just nothing.
The man that I loved and married is still alive, but in actuality, the person that I loved and married has been dead for a long time.
Lost to alcoholism, my father has been dead for 9 years. There has been no funeral.